Okay. Great. Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone to our next edition of the Future of Engineering Roundtables. And today we are going to focus on the state of the engineering economy and deep dive a bit into our Q4 2023 Business Engineering Sentiment Study. We released some of the highlights of the fall conference last month, but we want to really kind of dive in and give you the full details of the report. And we're also going to augment that with some great insights from our colleagues at ACEC and diving into some of the markets that Thomas is tracking. So let me go ahead and introduce our two panelists today. Thomas Grogan is the Senior Director of Economics and Private Markets at ACEC. And he is going to join our senior research consultant at the ACEC Research Institute, Joe Bates, who I know many of you know, and who is the author of the Sentiment Study. And so, Joe, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And as Carrie said, please feel free to drop us some questions or comments. We'll take those throughout the session as they come in and as time permits. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Daphne. And Thomas, I'd also like to say a great welcome to you. It's great to have you back on our webinar. And for those of you who saw our Q3 roundtable, you'll remember Thomas from there. And so we're really happy to have him back. And I think we have some great additional insights to share with you all today. So what we're going to talk about today should be familiar to those of you who have watched this before. We're going to talk about how the economy is doing right now, how the AE industry is doing, as well as what the future looks like. So with that, let's jump right into it. How is the economy doing? Well, today we got fresh data from the Census Bureau on the Q3 GDP, and they revised it up from a 4.9% GDP estimate to a 5.2% GDP estimate for the third quarter. So not only did we have a super strong Q3 in terms of US GDP, but they also revised it upwards. And to me, Thomas, this is really, really interesting because we have been waiting for a recession for quite a while now. I've called this the longest anticipated recession in US history. We did see GDP, softened just a tad in the first two quarters of the year, but this Q3 reading was very, very surprising, I think, to almost everybody. Would you say the same?
Yeah, I mean, especially with it being revised upward even further, though I think it kind of speaks to some things we touched on during our last webinar of the American consumer still consuming and spending, and that remains strong during the summer, as well as some of the other data points we're going to dive into in the forthcoming slides. Will kind of show why GDP is continuing to remain really strong.
Great. And I think you hit the nail on the head there with the consumer spending. That's in fact what the BLS highlighted for us in terms of what's driving the GDP. And we're also going to talk about what we think is going to happen in the coming months a little bit later on. But let's look at two things right now. We're going to do sort of a more of a deep dive on two items in the economy right now, as opposed to going through a lot of different slides on different topics. So two things we want to focus on today are the jobs and inflation. We know those are the two things that are the most important elements to the economy and how it's functioning right now. And everybody's a little bit concerned about what's going to happen. But we are seeing continued strong growth in terms of employment. And we are starting to see the unemployment rate tick up just a little bit, but that is actually a very good sign because we've been so hot. The labor markets have been running so hot in the last couple of years that we have to cool those down a little bit. And we are seeing some trends towards cooling of the labor market. If you look at the last 6 months of 2022, the average increase in employment was about 260,000 per month. And then the first 7 months of this year, that fell to about 190,000 per month. So we saw quite a bit of cooling. But then another big surprise in September, we saw in August and September, we saw 227,000 new jobs in August and 300,000 new jobs in September. That again was very surprising to most folks. So the Q3 has really been a hot one this year. Now October's numbers came in and we had 150,000 jobs. So that might indicate again a slight trend back towards cooling, but honestly, we've got so much momentum going here that I kind of feel like I'm not going to believe we'll be in a recession until I actually see it. Thomas, what are you seeing within our industry in terms of employment and unemployment?
Yeah, so our industry as a whole is kind of at almost peak employment levels, and then what we see in this chart for this table is showing, the relative unemployment rate for professional services is even further below the US national average. 3.9% is historically an extremely low unemployment rate for the US economy, and for professional services being even lower than that. It's just showing how strong the labor market is. It is that we'll see in a little bit. To your point, I would say decelerating the rate of growth there, but that's just also a function of there's only so many people working in the engineering, architectural, professional services, so you kind of have a supply constraint happening there with respect to the labor market.
Yeah, and that number within the industry, again, this is professional and related occupations, so it's much larger than just our industry, but that number has been hovering in the 2.0 to 2.5 range for quite a while now. So another aspect of employment is the labor force participation rate, and this is something that the regular participants of this webinar have heard me talk about a lot. And we are seeing just very slow improvements in that labor force participation rate. But what you see there is right during the recession that was produced by the pandemic, we saw that labor force participation rate shrink dramatically, and we just have not come close to regaining that percentage that we saw. We're about 0.6 or so, 0.7 points below that peak before the pandemic. So what that means is millions of people are still not back in the labor force compared to before the pandemic. There's a wide variety of reasons for that. We know that some working mothers and fathers as well, they stopped working to take care of children, and many of them didn't go back to work. We know that people are still sidelined with long COVID. There are millions of people that are suffering from that. And there's also the long-term trend that baby boomers were retiring, and that pandemic may have accelerated the retirement. So we're struggling, and I saw some improvement back in September, August and September, but then October it inched down just a bit. So I think we're still going to struggle with that labor force participation rate. So in terms of workforce, things are going very well, very strong economy. And let's turn to inflation. So one of the numbers we track from the business sentiment study is ACEC member firm executives telling us in this survey of about 600 firm executives what they think about the economy, about the industry, and about their own firm finances, and about a bunch of other issues like wages and inflation. So we saw that in the third quarter, when inflation was coming down, we saw a drop in concern about inflation. This is a net rating. For those of you who haven't participated in this before, we take the percent of positive responses and subtract it from the percent of negative responses, and you get this net rating. So we see sort of the balance of concern here. And a positive number when it comes to inflation concern is not what you want to see. So we saw that number jump back up in the fourth quarter. And I think, even though we're seeing inflation come down, we saw a couple months at the end of the summer where it sort of got stuck. And so I think that's what people are a little bit concerned about. And so when we look at the actual inflation numbers, we see this is the overall rate. So that's why it's called all items. And we have seen from June 2022 a decline from 9.1%, and it went down to about 3%. And then it started to bump back up. That coincided with our survey. Now, what's really interesting, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that our numbers came out before the government released their numbers. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're using the sentiment study now as a window into our future a little later in this webcast. So all items, it's coming down, it's a little stuck, but if you look under the hood a little bit, part of the reason for the volatility there is food and energy costs. And we're now seeing, especially gasoline, is coming down again. And when you take out those more volatile numbers and we look at just what's called the core rate, this has been dropping and it continues to drop. Now, two things you'll notice. One is that the core rate never got as high as the overall inflation rate, but it's now not dropped as far as the overall inflation rate. So we're still seeing some stickiness here. And, I think most folks are expecting these numbers to continue to come down, but that's to be seen. So Thomas, help us understand a little bit more about what's going on with inflation.
Yeah, so I think, the chart we were just looking at is showing how much prices are changing year over year, and seeing that kind of we hit a peak around June 2022, and that year over year percent change is coming down. That's basically disinflation. So prices are not growing as much, but they're still growing. And so I put this chart together looking at going back to January 2019. So essentially it's almost a 4-year period. For about 2 years, the 2-year period of January 2019 to January 2021, total prices only increased about 3.7%. But since January 2021, prices have increased 15.7%. So essentially, what is, I've seen a few articles recently about this, what you're paying at the grocery store, at the restaurant, at the doctor's office is basically 20% higher than pre-pandemic. And I think that 20% is really affecting household budgets, as well as business budgets as well. And so a bigger narrative that's happening around our economy and this recession that hasn't happened, but everyone is somewhat pessimistic, even though numbers like GDP are really high, the labor market is really strong, is that things are costing so much more now than compared to 2 years ago. And we as, the American society have not experienced this pain to our wallets in such a quick, short time as we have over the past 2 years.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And what I've heard from a lot of economists is once the average time from really seeing a significant slowdown in the U.S. economy from when rates stop rising, like interest rates. We know that the Fed has obviously raised interest rates quite a bit. Is about once they've stopped, on average, it takes 9 months for the full effects to hit the economy. So, Thomas, you've also got some information for us about household expenditures and some other data. Tell us what this is about.
Yeah, so I think, trying to, let's say, break down the chart, looking at the change in CPI year over year, realizing that, we're getting this one aggregated number, let's say it's 4%. Well, what people are spending their money on are a mixture of goods and services. And we talked about this last time, where households' goods consumption, so buying detergent or buying that washing machine, is a lot different than getting a haircut or seeing a dentist. And households spend about 70% of their money on services. And what we see here is that the cost of services is not declining at the same rate that the costs of goods are. So again, even if total CPI is not accelerating as much as it was last year, we're still feeling that pain in our overall budgets because services are still extremely high compared to a few years ago. And we see here the goods is a bit more subject to things like supply chain constraints, and that's something that we'll touch on more, that did have an impact on that inflation we saw last year, though even now, say, supply chains have improved overall prices because services is such a large component of what we spend our money on is not coming down in costs the way goods are.
Yeah, on the webcast we had a couple weeks ago with John Gray, who is our resident economist, he shared with us the forecast for the industry and sort of some of the other things that are going on in the economy right now. And he talked a lot about those issues as well. So if you missed that, you can always go watch that webinar. So we see also that, we don't have a slide on this, but we still are seeing wage inflation as well. And we know that that's a big concern. We will be asking our member firms about wages in the Q1 survey in January. So, that's going to be something that I'm interested in seeing how the wages are working right now, because the last 2 years we have seen double-digit increases reported to us by member firms. So kind of curious to see if that is moderating some or not. So that's something to look forward to as well. So we talked about the consumer prices, but Thomas, what's happening at the wholesale level and with producer prices?
Right. So, essentially continuing on what we talked about during our last webinar, we can see that the cost of non-residential construction has actually increased above and beyond what the household inflation impacts have been. Now, good news is that we do see, at least on the left-hand side, the total non-residential construction costs have seen a slight dip and have plateaued. The non-residential construction cost is going to be the cost of everything. So the labor, as well as the cement and the steel and things like that. On the right-hand side, we see how much costs of engineering services have increased over the past 4 years, essentially pre-pandemic. And they have not plateaued, but we also see they have not increased anywhere near the level that the total non-residential construction costs have. And, to your point, engineering services is essentially labor costs. And so, this is in line with what member firms have reported in terms of increasing wages. This cost and services, is not at the level of overall economic inflation, but it's still about 12 to 14% higher now than it was, 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And someone asked me a question when I was presenting to a group of member firms recently, and they asked if we have seen pricing power, sort of increasing. And we have to be very careful when we talk about pricing in a association setting. But I took sort of a straw poll, and anecdotally, the feedback I received was yes, the firms, because the labor markets are tight, because inflation has been pushing costs up, and there's just a scarcity of people to do the work, that there's some pricing power being realized as well. So, I think it all tells part of the same story. The other thing, Thomas, that I wanted to talk about is what the Federal Reserve is doing right now. We normally talk about the mortgage rates, because those are tied very closely to what the federal funds rate is doing. But after these numbers came out the last couple months, especially just the last few weeks, really, mortgage rates have come down dramatically. We were seeing going up at 8%, And then we got some good news here in the economy, and those numbers have come back down almost to 7% in just about a month's time. So that is certainly some good news. And I know there's a lot of economists who are saying, okay, we're going to see a mild recession early next year, and then the Fed is going to start cutting rates. So let's hold on to that one for just a minute, because I want to come back to that and talk about that and get your opinion on that as well, Thomas.
I think that's the same recession we were going to see at the beginning of this year, right, Joel?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like I'm not gonna predict a recession at this point, even though most folks are saying that we are going to see a slowdown maybe in the first quarter, second quarter. But again, third quarter came in super hot. The revision was up. We know for sure that we're not going to see that big of a number in the fourth quarter, which that data will be released in January. But honestly, we just keep seeing the trend is to a stronger economy than anyone seems to be predicting. So, we'll come back to that issue in just a few minutes as we talk about the future. But let's take a little bit closer look here at what is happening within our industry. And Thomas, this is one of your slides, so take it away.
Yeah, so I mean, our industry continues to post strong year-over-year growth. Total revenues for AE services for the second quarter of 2023 were up 9.5% year over year, and that's extremely strong. I mean, in any situation, having 9.5% year over year growth is really good. One thing I do like about having charts is that it does give you information and put that into context. And what we do see, though, is a slight plateauing over the past few quarters in this year, kind of year over year growth. But also, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you look at what happened during 2020, that I think is really interesting is we had a peak in the first quarter of 2020, and then there was COVID, shutdown, lockdown, all that. There was, I think, about a 5 to 10% decline, but in about a year, the industry was back. So it made up those revenue. It was back to basically pre-COVID revenues, and then it's continued to grow. And so I think that story of like a very, very quick recovery here is what's making our industry unique compared to some of the slides that we were looking at in the beginning when you were showing labor force participation. As the economy as a whole, certain things aren't back. It's might taking a while to return to pre-COVID levels, but for our industry, we went right back. And then over the end of 2021 through really today, and we'll see it on the next slide, having double-digit year-over-year growth has just been extremely strong.
Yeah, and I think the other point to put this into context is when we went through the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, et cetera, we didn't come back to revenue levels that were in 2008 until about 5 or 6 years after that. I mean, yep. Years. So you're right. And of course, we all know the story here as well, that the IIJA has been a huge shot in the arm for our industry as well. That is obvious in these numbers. So you were talking about plateaus, Thomas. Do you see that in some other areas here?
Yeah, so this chart on the left is looking at the year-over-year growth, and so from about the third quarter of 2021 until the beginning of 2023, so about 6 quarters in a row, we had over 10% year-over-year growth. You see that at the end of 2022, there's about 16 to 17% year-over-year growth. This past quarter, 9.5% year-over-year growth, for showing a slight, it's still growing. It's still growing. It's just not growing at this kind of astronomical level. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what we're seeing on the right-hand side in terms of the employment in the AE sector is that starting around the beginning of the summer, our monthly increase in jobs is kind of flattened a bit. So it's not going down, but we're not adding as many jobs on a monthly basis that we were from basically summer 2020, when we were at the bottom of employment in our industry, until the spring of this year. To your point, I was looking at the data during the financial recession. It took 7 years, if we extended this chart out, to look at what the peak A&E services employment was in 2008. It took 7 years to get back to that level of employment. It took less than a year, essentially, during COVID to return to pre-COVID employment and then continue to grow. So the labor market is extremely tight and strong in our industry.
Yeah, I think that's, that is one of the big stories here. And the other thing I think that's interesting is you are seeing this plateau in your data. So I want to share a little bit more of the business sentiment survey data. And what we're seeing here is that in the US economy, sentiment regarding the US economy actually fell just a little bit from Q3 to Q4 this year. And that was a little bit surprising to me. But, it kind of fits with this idea that, okay, we can't just keep growing. And, we're going to hit that plateau. We're going to hit a bump somewhere along the way. But nonetheless, it's a good number. We've come a long ways from, a couple years ago where these were negative regarding the US economy. But we have also, to your point, Thomas, in the industry, as well as firm finances, these net ratings have almost never been below 80. I was looking back at all the data. We've done this now for 13 quarters, and there were only 1 or 2 quarters where these numbers fell below 80. So, astronomically high sentiment regarding the strength of our industry and the strength of firms' finances. So, the industry is doing very well. When we talk about the state of the engineering industry, it's doing extremely well right now. And when we dive into the sectors, we also see that there's a lot of sectors that are sort of overperforming others, but still all of these numbers are green in terms of the overall numbers. We are seeing a softening just a little bit again in many of these sectors, as we saw a little softening with some of the numbers regarding the industry and firm finances, but again, very strong numbers. And these circles are the areas where the sentiment is the highest. So we still are seeing energy and utilities, transportation in a variety of areas, water, wastewater, all of these are being sort of pushed up even higher by the IIJA. So things are going very well. Yes, Daphne.
Yeah, so we have a question that came in related to the softening that you're mentioning. Concerns, you see this as the beginning of a trend? Are we going to keep softening, or do you think it's just a little blip on the radar?
For me, that's a hard one to tell, because when we start to look at the forward-looking data, everything's pretty strong there as well. And when we look at backlogs in particular, Daphne, the backlogs are staying strong. We're not seeing any weakness there. So personally, I think it's inevitable that we're going to have some softening because those numbers are so high, but I don't have any concerns about our industry right now at all, at least from the sentiment data that I'm seeing. Thomas, what does your data tell you about the sectors? Is it falling in line with what we're seeing from the sentiment study?
Yeah, I think maybe the year over year growth, we're not going to see a 15%, but it doesn't mean there's not still year over year growth. And one thing to keep in mind is economic performance versus business financials are kind of two different things. And so if there aren't more employees to hire to do more work, then it's not necessarily a net bad negative impact to you, because we are a services industry and we can only bill our time, and we only have 24 hours in a day. So there's frankly a limit. Even if there were more, if there's more money out there, and this is actually something that you ask about in your survey, is, have you had to turn down work because you didn't have the staffing? And that number, I'm not sure if it made it into today's presentation, but that has been pretty high the past few quarters. And so essentially, there's more than enough business out there for, the specific individual firm. I don't see it really being a downward trend where we're going to see something like we saw during COVID or even the financial recession of 08, 09.
Yeah, I think that those are all really good points. So I wanted to show you some of the data again that I have that for me says the softening is not a concern. And again, we do see softening in terms of the net rating and the status of your backlog compared to 3 months ago. So again, a little bit of softening in the numbers there, but when you look at the median number of months of backlog, it's very strong. We're not seeing any weakness there. We're not seeing a downward trend at all. When we look at the last couple of years of this data, we see that it's always been between 10 and 12 months. Sometimes you'll see a little blip, but again, we're not seeing any significant issues. Now, what I do see a little bit of is when you look at the average length of the backlogs, that is getting a little shorter. So again, median is holding very strong, very steady, but the average is coming down just a little bit. And I think that's why we're seeing some of these softening in the net ratings of backlog as well. But again, nothing that I'm seeing shows any concern overall for the industry as we move ahead. And then
Joe,
when you look at hiring, yeah, Daphne.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in with a question while you're talking about backlog. So someone's asking about, the AIA billings index is still softening. And so I guess it's either for either one of you, but do you think that's going to have effect on our industry? Is it going to have effect on our kind of our future piece?
So, I need to take a closer look and maybe try to do some correlation analysis with the AIA billings index and some of our data. And I haven't had a chance to do that yet, Daphne. So I think that's a really good point to make, though. And, to me, it just shows that, hey, there's all the numbers are softening just a little bit, but nothing's falling. No one's sort of sounding an alarm yet. Thomas, do you see anything different or have a different thought?
No, I agree with your take and have not deep dived into that extensively. But, I think, again, the amount of spending on infrastructure and investment in different aspects of infrastructure is keeping, especially with respect to the engineering industry, that employment high. And so again, I think there might be pockets of areas where that's going to be affected differently. And while the AE firms do a lot of work together, there are some industries that are primarily served by one group more so or less so than the other. And, we will touch on this a bit later, but while the economy in aggregate is doing great, there are pockets here and there that are not performing as well, that might be more, architectural services might be more embedded with. And so, it's kind of hard to tell right now in the aggregate how that will all shake out.
Yeah, I'm going to make a note, Joe, for us to do some diving on that, looking at those correlations between AIAs and ours and see if we can find anything there.
Yeah,
good
I think
point.
That's a good idea. Yeah, good questions from the audience. Keep those questions coming. We love to answer questions that we can. In the meantime, here we go with some more sentiment data. Again, in terms of the labor force within our industry, what we're hearing from firm executives is that it is still strong. 9 out of 10 firms still have open positions. This number has not changed in the last 2 years since we started collecting this data. And the median number of open positions has held steady at before. It did come down from Q3 from Q2. We saw a median number of positions going from 5 to 4. Again, that's not a bad thing at all, because the market is just so tight. The labor market is so tight. And we didn't see a change in the overall median this quarter from last quarter. But what's a little interesting to me is when you look at large firms, those with more than 500 FTE, we see that median number fell just a little bit from 100 to 93. So that's good news as well, though, because there's so many open positions right now that we kind of need to see a little bit of a softening of the labor market. We also look at the percentage of positions open in terms of total FTE, and that has been very consistent at about 10% of all positions. But when you look at the firm size, this is kind of interesting. Smaller firms have been having a much harder time attracting a talent than some of the larger firms, and even mid-size and small-ish firms. But I was listening today to CNBC, and there was a commentator who was saying that they also have seen that smaller firms throughout the last couple of years, not just in our industry, obviously, but across the United States, small companies, small businesses are having a harder time attracting talent because the larger companies maybe can offer more attractive salaries, more attractive benefits packages. So that is an interesting distinction here when we look at the number of open positions by firm size. All right, we're ready to move to the next section unless there's any other questions, Daphne. Okay, great. Let's keep on trucking here. All right, so let's take a look at the future. And this is what I think everybody really likes to talk about. And I know I like talking about it with you as well, Thomas. So let's take a look at a slide from our last presentation a couple weeks ago. This is our updated industry forecast, and we do see here that we're predicting for 2023 full year total growth of almost 8%. Now, that's very, very strong, and it's even better than what we had thought we were going to see last year at this time. So these numbers are all better than we had thought. 2024 is also looking to be stronger than what we had anticipated. And then, as you can see in 2025, some of the effects, the boosting of our industry by the IIJA starts to wind down a little bit, and we get more to what we call our trend growth rate of about 3%. So again, these numbers are very good, and we always get the question, Thomas, about inflation and how that is affecting these overall growth rates. You mentioned earlier that you're seeing 10% year-over-year growth in your data, and we're seeing, again, similar types of numbers here. But when you factor in inflation, because it has been fairly high, the real output growth is a bit more modest. So I think that's kind of important to point out here. But still, a very, very positive forecast from our economists in terms of what we're going to see with the industry. And when we look at sentiment data, this one is really interesting to me because we have now seen a decline in future. And now talking about 12 months ahead, firm executives are saying, no, we're a little less optimistic about the U.S. economy than we were a quarter ago. We came back from some bad numbers in the third quarter, but now it's kind of trending down again, a little bit more softening. So even when we look ahead, we're seeing sentiment starting to soften just a bit, as well as within the industry and even firm finances. But again, that number, that 43, was a high watermark that we had not seen before. So still very, very healthy outlook. But it may be a little bit more cautious right now. And we've seen that throughout the time that we've been conducting the sentiment survey. We have repeatedly seen that the future sentiment is much less strong than the current sentiment. So there's always been that disconnect of, all right, things are going really, really well, but I'm worried about the future. And we saw this a year ago, and we're still doing really well. So again, I think there's always this cautious optimism about the future, but everybody's a little concerned. And I personally think part of that is because we keep hearing, oh, we're going to get a recession, we're going to get a recession, and it just hasn't happened yet. So, it's very interesting to me to see what's going on here with the sentiment for the future. But when we get to that future, things are still very good. When we look at sentiment within the industry and we look at it by firm size, this was interesting to me as well, that smaller firms did not see a decline in their future sentiment, but we saw it among some of the medium and large firms. So again, this just says to me that, all right, there is some softening there, but nothing that's really of great concern. And in fact, we see that, some of the firm numbers are coming in line with each other. Typically, we see small firms have lower sentiment, whether it's current or future. When it doesn't matter if it's the U.S. economy or firm finances, smaller firms tend to be a little less optimistic than the larger firms. And we're just starting to see a little bit of it evening out across firm sizes, at least in under 200 FTE size. And then when we look at our sectors from the sentiment data, we also see that most sectors saw a decline in future sentiment, but we're still seeing some strength here. The circles, again, are the higher ones, and those are, again, transportation related, as well as energy and utilities, or wastewater. So the same areas that we're seeing very strong numbers right now in the current sentiment, we're seeing those going forward as well, being the stronger areas. Thomas, I always love to get your take on the sector sentiment data, because you always pull out a few interesting nuggets here that I tend to overlook. What kind of jumped out to you here in the sector data?
Well, I think if we look at the ones that have clearly negative outlooks, they're all very interest rate financing dependent. And, let's look at commercial real estate, far and away the least positive outlook. We'll talk about that a little bit in a future slide. But these land development groups, where the change in the interest rate over the past year and few months has really impacted activity there. I think that's something that whenever interest rates do come down, those industries can start, I think that's what's driving a lot of that negative sentiment. I'm always interested why our engineering firms are not more bullish on the industrial and manufacturing facilities when we see how much money has been spent and is going to be continued to be invested in those industries, especially with everything that's happening at the kind of fiscal policy level. So that I find interesting. And then the other things, the industries like the roads, transportation, utilities, that all aligns with what kind of we've been seeing for the past 18 months with everything with respect to, the IIJA, IRA, and investments there in general.
Great. Well, and then when we look at backlog, future anticipated backlog 12 months from now, we don't see a softening there. So again, it's like there's some areas where we're seeing some softening, but then when it comes to backlog, which is probably the backbone of what our firms do here, that has stayed very strong. So nothing of concern looking forward in terms of backlogs either.
Hey, Joe, if you could just go, you don't need to go back to the slide, but when you were showing the forecast, there was the nominal and the real output. And we just have a question about what's the difference between the two. And I think the answer is inflation.
Yeah, you got it, Daphne. You've become an expert with our data as well. So, but that's exactly what it is. When you talk about nominal output growth, that is just top line dollars. And when you talk about real output, you're putting you're factoring in the effect of inflation. So it's leveled. You take out the effect of inflation and you see where the real output is, and that's the more solid number. It's great to see 10% year-over-year revenue increases, but is part of that because you're having to pay people more to do the same work? Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Thanks, Joe.
Sure. Thomas, anything you wanted to add on that?
No, you hit it on the head.
So when we talk about concern regarding the economy and our industry and firm finances going forward, the follow-up question that we ask in the sentiment survey is, what are you concerned about? If you aren't feeling positive, what are your concerns? And this, this has been one of the most interesting slides to me throughout the past couple of years, because we are seeing a lot of changes over time. You can see, for instance, the effects of the pandemic. I mean, even in the last year, it's gone almost down to nothing at this point. 2 years ago, that was very, very hot. Supply chain issues, those continue to be less of a concern among people who are concerned regarding what's happening with the economy and the industry. So those issues are lessening. We started asking this one about a year ago, concern about rollout of the IIJA, and it really hasn't been a huge concern. We've had some issues in some places. Most of it, from what we're hearing, is it's just the process has been slowed down because there aren't enough people. There's not enough people in the government to work these contracts through. There's not enough people in our industry to execute on all the contracts. So it's just maybe a little slower rolling out for some people in some places. Recession concerns are also coming down. They were very, very high a year ago, and they have come down. It's still relatively elevated. But where are things kind of going up? What's happened here? Inflation and rising costs, that fell and then bounced back in Q4. Political uncertainty and the political environment, that kind of started to fall a little bit, as jumped back up. I think people are starting to focus on the election next year, which we referenced earlier in this webinar. I think that's going to continue to be a concern, because what will happen to the economy, to our industry, because of the effects of political uncertainty? That, I think, is a concern. And then interest rates. So we've got inflation, rising costs, interest rates, and worker shortage. These are all still at the top. General economic uncertainty. So I want to dive a little bit into some of these issues. And we'll talk about what is of greatest concern. So here's another slide that we presented a couple weeks ago, and I wanted to bring it back today because, again, it's showing us that in the first, second, third quarter of next year, somewhere in there, we feel like there's going to be some negative GDP numbers. And this is kind of the outlook that you're seeing from Wells Fargo Economics, as well as the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So, these are some of the best minds that we have looking at this. But yet again, a year ago, people were saying we'd be in a recession in the third and fourth quarter of this year. And it obviously did not happen. I mean, the third quarter GDP number, that's nowhere near recessionary. So I personally think, Thomas, that we are not going to see a recession. Even if we see some negative GDP numbers, I don't think we're going to have a real recession, if you will, because I also took a look before this webinar today, Thomas, and I was looking at the forecast for the unemployment rate into next year. Most economists don't see it going above 4.1, 4.2%. That's not, in my mind, recessionary numbers when it comes to employment. And typically we have to see unemployment go up significantly to actually feel the effects of a recession. So in my mind, I'm not going to believe a recession until I actually see it. The GDP numbers aren't showing it at the moment. The jobs numbers aren't showing it at the moment. Consumer spending is slowing just a little bit, but it's still very, very strong. I mean, it's what's holding up our economy. So that's my take on it. Thomas, I'm really interested in what you think. Are we going to hit a recession next year or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think if, we use the definition of recession as 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth, I don't see that happening. And to your point, we're kind of hovering. I think that's what makes it tough, is this economic uncertainty. Could there be 1 quarter of negative GDP growth, and maybe that's like negative 0.2%? It's possible, probably not likely. Also, to a point we've been trying to emphasize is that the labor market is just strong because there's not enough people working to fill all the jobs that need to be filled. That, if certain finances or numbers come down, does that necessarily mean businesses are going to have to then turn around and lay off people when they don't have enough people to do the work they need to do? It's kind of hard to figure that all out, but I am not pessimistic about GDP growth over the next year.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think if anything, we're going to see numbers on the upside rather than the downside at this point, unless, and I heard someone else caution this, unless there's a shock to the system, right? I mean, we could have something completely unexpected happen, but those things are also not predictable. You have some other data that you wanted to share as well in terms of looking forward. What are you seeing here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when looking at forecasts, I just kind of like to take a lot of them and figure out what the range is. And, you know, to your point, for the lower three line items, the forecasts are kind of around consensus. The biggest variance is in the Fed funds rate, and you know, that's ranging from 1.75 to 4.25 that different banks are, you know, predicting it will be at the end of 2024. I think, you know, that is when the cuts happen, if they happen, how much they are is going to have a big effect on things, and that's, you know, very uncertain at this point. But, you know, even a worst case scenario, looking at the unemployment rate of 4.8%, that is, you know, in terms of long-term economic performance, not bad at all. I mean, it was only 3 years ago, 3 years and a few months, that we had a spike where the unemployment rate went up almost to like 20%, right? So it really is not something that will cause like catastrophic change. And again, everyone is looking at GDP growing, not at these extremely high levels we saw over the past 2 years, but it's still GDP growth. The inflation piece, I think those numbers seem kind of optimistic, just given everything and what we're seeing in the data in terms of the rate of change not increasing or declining as much. But, you know, overall, this is kind of showing, you know, for lack of a better term, the economy is going to be pretty boring, but that's not a bad thing if boring means moving forward and no shocks. So yeah, this is kind of what some of the banks are saying, as well as the Fed.
Yeah, and Thomas, I think, you know, this whole thing about where the federal funds rate is going to be, we're hearing all this talk right now about, okay, we're going to have a slowdown early next year. The Fed's not going to raise rates anymore, and they're going to start to cut them. And I'm thinking to myself, first of all, by historic standards, the rates are not at a bad place right now. And why would the Fed want to cut rates unless we have a more serious economic slowdown? Because once you lower them, you take away some of the ammunition that the Fed has if we do hit a bump in the road, right? So I personally, I am not anticipating the Fed's going to cut rates. I just don't see that happening, especially because I don't think we're going to have a recession. One of our participants, one of the viewers today, they said, well, isn't a 2 negative quarters of GDP a recession? So that's a really interesting point, right? Because we've always talked about that. We've always said, yeah, that's the technical definition of a recession. But at the beginning of 2022, we also had 2 quarters of negative GDP. But that was not a recession. We have, and Thomas, my memory is bad, but tell us what the name of that body is, if you know who is the one that calls
I think it's the National, NBER is the acronym, and I think it's like the National Bureau of Economic Research. Right. And to also the point, they declare it months, if not years after the fact, because data gets revised, as we learned today, you know, with these GDP numbers. So it takes a little bit of time to truly see what that real number was. And yeah, to your point, there could be a technical recession, but the impact to the US households population is not the same as, say, the financial crisis, right? Because the labor market was just not impacted, frankly, at all the way it has been in past recessions.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's my take on it too. So what do you think is going to happen here with inflation going forward and the supply chain?
Right. So, inflation is the hot topic. To your point about will the Fed cut rates, and if so, how much, right? I think the biggest concern is taking the foot off the brake and inflation spiking back up. Most data that has come out over the past 6 to 8 months with respect to inflation shows it has been going down. But as we kind of dived into the components of it, the price of goods has come down. What we see here is what the global supply chain pressure index, we had this unprecedented level of supply chain congestion during 2020, 2021. That was really what drove that. That was a big component of what drove that huge spike in costs a year ago. That's under control. But again, that's just with respect to goods, right? Services aren't getting on a boat, shipping, going through the canals, being delayed at ports. That still is 70% of the economy, which, what we could get the price of goods under control, but the services is still a tougher nut to crack with respect to inflation. So, I think on the whole, inflation that is going in the direction the Fed would like to see it go, which would give them the confidence to cut rates more. But there's still work to be done. So, even just today with the new release of numbers, people seem to be thinking there could be a cut as early as January 2024. That seems extremely optimistic, but never know.
So that I think you're right. I'm on the same page as you are again.
Mhm.
But one of the things that we're talking about is consumer spending, right?
Right.
That is the engine of our economy. So what are you seeing when it comes to consumer spending?
Right. So, what, let's say, defied expectations this past year was the consumer spending. And the big story has been all the savings that was built up in households during COVID. And essentially, this chart on the left is showing by income classification who has savings left. And really, it's just the top 20%, that yellow line, basically the households in the top 20th percentile of income. Everyone else has basically depleted or is kind of projected to deplete their savings right around now. I think this is something we talked about a little bit last time as a metric to continue to track. This is kind of, showing that, another 5.2% GDP growth seems unlikely. But again, everyone is employed, so they are earning money to spend. It's just kind of what is that magnitude that will happen. But yeah, those kind of extreme shocks in growth are probably not likely. Also included this other chart looking at commercial real estate. I will give a quick plug to the private markets group here at ACEC. We are releasing our commercial and residential private insights brief tomorrow. And we had on Rebecca Rocky, who's deputy chief economist at Cushman Wakefield. She actually provided us with this chart, but essentially going back to recessions, if you're in the commercial real estate sector, you're in a recession, right? There, it's declined for several quarters in a row, primarily a factor of interest rates, as well as just general, let's call it demographic changes in terms of work from home, where people are living, et cetera. I bring this up less to sound the alarms that I think everything is crashing, but more so highlight the resilience of kind of the economy as a whole, that we can have these different pockets of certain sectors which are not performing or growing, but you have these other sectors that are growing. So when you look at it in aggregate, we are seeing 2-3% growth, a really strong labor market. At the beginning of this year, there were a lot of layoffs in the tech sector. The freight industry is basically going through a recession right now, with a lot of companies closing, shutting down because of the change in shipping costs and all of that. So while we have been very optimistic, and especially with the AE industry as a whole, there are these other pockets that are seeing or struggling. And I think that as long as they don't get too extreme, unfortunately, that's kind of a good sign for the economy, that it can support pockets here or there. When there's weakness in one area, there's strength in the other. So on the net, we're able to continue to basically have a very low unemployment rate and have positive GDP growth.
Well, we're just about out of time here. In fact, we're a minute over, but I'm just going to quickly hit on this in the next slide, and we'll wrap it up. Again, sentiment survey data says we expect strong hiring to continue. And then this is the really important slide that we just didn't have enough time to talk in detail about. But what we're seeing is that the sentiment data that we're collecting at the ACEC Research Institute is actually turning out to be a leading indicator of other macroeconomic data. And this is also what's giving me more confidence in saying that, hey, I don't think we're going to see terrible GDP numbers next year. I don't think we're going to see higher unemployment next year, because when we look at the sentiment data, and again, it's softening, but we're not seeing it turn negative in any meaningful way. So this is something we're going to report more on in the coming months, but something that I want to be sure that you all are aware of, so that we can start to help you understand how to use the sentiment data to predict what's going to happen in the future. So this slide just sums up what we have already talked about today. So we're going to kind of skip over this one in the interest of time, but these the slides will be available for all of you, as well as the recording. You can come back and have your colleagues watch and listen to this as well. So with that, Daphne, why don't you close us out?
Great. Thank you so much, Thomas and Joe, for all of your insights and lots of great data as always. I do want to give a shout out to our donors who make this research and this presentation possible. Thank you so much. I know many of you are on with us today. If you're not on the list, please give us a call and we'll help you learn how to become part of our donor family. And I also just want to throw up quickly, Joe, the slide with the QR code. If you take a quick shot of this, it will take you straight to the full report, so you can dive into all the numbers. I know there were a few questions we didn't get to. If you want to circle back with me directly, I don't know who you are because it's anonymous, but if you shoot me a note, we'll try and get an answer for you on the couple of questions we ran out of time. Also, just want to give you some information that on December 13th, we've got our next Future of Engineering Roundtable. And that is going to be on private equity. So we are looking at a fair and balanced look at private equity and what it means to firms. And we've got a great panel lined up for that. So go to the Institute website, sign up for that, and we will look forward to seeing you then. Until then, stay well, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everybody.